Hey guys, welcome back to Celtic Calling. We're back on track this week, and this week's Celtic Calling is going to be about the goddess Arianrhod. Now that's how the pronunciation is given here. I understand that there are different interpretations of, and if I'm saying it wrong then forgive me, but there we go. Okay, so Arianrhod, meaning silver wheel or disc, called the silver wheel that descends into the sea. Daughter of the mother goddess Dawn and her consort Valai. Ruler of the Caer Sea, a magical realm to the north. Also called the silver wheel because of the fact that the dead were carried on her oar wheel to Imania, Moonland or Land of the Dead, which belonged to her as a deity of reincarnation and karma. I believe that little bit about the reincarnation bit does come from Graves's book, which some people are debate about whether or not some of it is made up. Has been connected to the triple aspect given as Blodeuwedd, and Arianrhod and Morrigu. Blodeuwedd being the maiden, and Arianrhod being the mother, and the Morrigu being the crone. Now I'm going to stop before we go into myth and just touch on that slightly, because I've seen a lot of, in the course of my research, a lot of description of Arianrhod as being a primal goddess unto herself, of having the triple aspect unto herself, and yet the sort of modern, I think it's quite modern interpretation of her as being, connecting her as a triple goddess through Blodeuwedd is in her own mythology, and then Morrigu in the crone aspect. I'm not quite sure how this has come about. And there are similarities between the two goddesses, which I touch on in the process of this video. I'm not sure I completely agree with that as a triple goddess, or whether that has just been sort of created in a more modern sense. There is some connection as well with Arianrhod and saying she's connected to Morgana Le Fay, and I'm not quite sure how that comes about either. The main mythos that I can find from way back is the main one, which we're going to have to look at because there doesn't seem to be much else other than personal interpretation, which is the story of Mathonwe. And outside of that, she seems to have lost a lot of the myth again, whether this is an oral tradition thing, whether this is the onset of Christianity and her myths have purposefully been sort of waylaid. I'm not entirely sure. However, giving her primal goddess status, which a lot of people have suggested whom they work with her energies, and given the fact that she is a lunar deity and rules her own court even, I don't see why we need to say, you know, that she has these other goddesses as her other aspects. Technically you can link all in goddesses are all interlinkable, and you can argue that forefront, but my sense from this is that she has plenty of clout on her own, and I don't see why there are these pairings. I can understand the Blodeuwedd because she's in the myths, but she was created as a maiden in spite, if you like, we're going to discuss the myth in a minute, of Arianrhod. So it doesn't make sense that that would be a maiden aspect of the goddess to me. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's all up to personal interpretation with that, but that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I'm not quite sure where the idea that she can shapeshift into an owl came from. I couldn't see any of that imagery. I know that imagery is linked to Blodeuwedd in her myth, where she gets turned into an owl as punishment, and I guess that's where the connection comes from, if they're connecting her to the maiden mother form. I'm not entirely sure about that, though. It seemed a bit like a modern crisscrossing of myth into making them a triple aspect rather than just allowing her to be a triple aspect by herself. The main surviving story about Arianrhod is that of Math Thonway, and on the basis of it, she has a very negative role within this. We're going to actually pick it apart a bit more than we did in the Goedian video, who is her brother. Okay, so she first comes up in that story following the misbehaviour of her brother when Math needs a new foot attendant, foot holder, or so, and they have to be a virgin. Goedian suggests his own sister, Arianrhod, and there is a suggestion of reluctance that she doesn't want the job and is in fact forced to step over a magical staff to prove her virginity. As she steps over the staff, 2 children that she has conceived but is unaware of topple out of her. I mean, there are arguments against whether she was unaware of them as well. One is the unformed blob, which Goedian snatches up and places in a chest and is transformed into the magical boy Lou. The other, Dylan, is a sea creature of some kind who escapes and swims away. In some versions of the story, he is drowned either by Goedian or by Arianrhod herself. Why she would drown him in some versions, why Goedian would drown him and not the other one in some versions, you know, we will leave that hanging and we will discuss that in a second. When Goedian introduces Lou at Arianrhod's own court, she accuses him of trying to shame her further and therefore places 3 geis, sort of curses, on the boy. She shall not name him, arm him, and he shall not have a mortal wife. These are all realms of the rights of a Welsh mother to give to her son. To deny him is sort of denying his manhood. And there has been a lot of discussion and debate around her actions. Claire Hamilton, in her piece Arianrhod, Bad Mother or Mythic Goddess, points out, if Arianrhod, it's gonna get me each and every time, really is the great mother of the sacred king child, then why does she seem so vindictive? What are these so-called curses about? Why does she seem to be denying her son his rights? And why is she so powerful that Goedian, her brother, has to work so hard to outwit her? In addressing these questions, we should bear in mind the strong possibility that by the time her tale was written down by the Welsh monks, they had spotted her pagan power and decided to deliberately slander her name. So, if you want the myth in a little bit more detail, it's all in the Goedian video, and I don't really want to go through every single part of the myth again, or you can look it up yourself, of course. But there are some key points that I think are worth bearing in mind. The Christianization of the myths is well worth keeping in mind, and we can talk in relation to the Morrigan's myths as well, of course, here, although I wouldn't pair them together as a triple, but you can see similarities. So, the Christianization of her myths, does that mean that she has basically been demonized into a vindictive, spiteful woman? Because the role of the mother in Christianity is very set, in terms of the monks who would be, you know, writing it down. They had this clear view of motherhood and what motherhood should be, and caring and innate and natural, and therefore by making her all these other things they turn her into something unnatural and to be feared and despised rather than embraced and loved in her pagan goddess sense. That's a very real possibility within the myth. So, things to consider in the myth. The idea of what a virgin is in modern terminology versus what it was. And back then, before perhaps the Christianization of the myths, virgin would have meant unmarried. And now we associate it with this modern sense of sexually untouched. And I have to say that in a lot of discussions of Arianrhod, there is this sort of idea that she may have been quite sexually active, and there is suggestion of sexually active with mermen and things of that nature, and connections to the sea. Now, in sort of a pagan sense, if you consider her the idea of the moon dipping into the sea, that might have been symbolic of the great rite, which we often see in a lot of myth, of the mating of male and female. If, you know, the sea had a masculine energy to it and her moon had a feminine energy to it, although you can argue that there are both energies in both, of course, then the dipping into the sea could have been like the mating of the cycles. And as the moon is quite frequently associated with sort of the lunar cycle is quite often, at least in modern senses, associated with the sort of female menstrual cycle, and then the sort of growing to pregnancy. It's very possible that previously there was some of that tied in, that her sexual promiscuity wasn't considered sexual promiscuity, it was just the realm of a goddess in her sexual prime. And then that has something that would threaten Christian mythos. So, because the idea of a woman being sexually free became something to be abhorred rather than promoted. Therefore, they had to turn her into something not free and wild and a goddess in her own right, but rather a woman who was promiscuous and therefore shamed in this myth. Because when she steps over the magical stuff, then she gives birth, and some argue unwittingly, some argue deceptively, to these two children. But I mean, if she must have known that if she had known, why would she do it? Or why would she have stepped over the magical stuff and give birth to two children? One who initially was a malformed blob and the other who's a sea creature. Now, the giving birth of magical children is a clear indicator of being a goddess. And, you know, sometimes it's also sort of used as a way of demonization of a woman. You know, the unnatural from her loins sort of thing. That's used throughout history, never mind myth. I mean, like Anne Boleyn, it's used in history rather than, you know, to sort of demonize a woman. Gwydion scoops up the unformed blob, and the unformed blob becomes Lugh. The sea creature in some mythos escapes, and in some is drowned by Gwydion or Arianrhod. Why either of them would drown one and not the other, that doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me. I'm just wondering if the whole drowning thing is some sort of punishment that is later prescribed, because she, in some of the myths, is, after fleeing, is drowned in her own kingdom in some versions of the myth. And I just wonder if that introduction of things is sort of a bastardization of that moon dipping into the water type thing, of the full cycles. There is energies around here whereby she has karmic and rebirth aspects to her. So it's not impossible that some of the myths, earlier myths, involved that in a rebirth sense, like the going into waters to be reborn sense. But you'd think, and perhaps because she's a female goddess, that was sort of used as drowning rather than a sort of rebirth through baptization sense. Maybe if it had been a masculine god, that might have been the rebirth of something. I'm not sure. It's just my thoughts and feelings on this, by the way. This is all I can give you, really. So she is shamed by men at that point and leaves in anger, and she feels shamed again when by Gwydion brings Lugh. Now, the anger and resentment have sort of been viewed in two main ways that I can see in the writing. One is that she is a female goddess who would not be shamed by men, that they brought her into the court. I'm wondering if stepping over the magical staff is ritually symbolic of something else, because her brother is said to be the father of Lugh, and she was ashamed of Lugh in this myth. And Gwydion is considered to be the magician, the trickster. Is therefore it possible that stepping over the magical staff of Math, who is his uncle, is somehow integrated with the earlier ideas of his brother raping the handmaiden? Is there some revenge there from Math, like knowing that Gwydion had this love for his sister which he shouldn't have, and therefore stepping over the magical staff sort of somehow led to this magical birth of their children? Was that an unwitting pregnancy that she neither wanted nor asked for and was sort of forced upon her? Is that a possibility? Is it possible that as the relationship between god and goddess is not quite so clear-cut as being in men, that the story of them and their energies and things had to become demonized in a way, you know? Was it originally perhaps that they were two halves of the same thing, and therefore that's how the children were born, through the magical cycles of, I don't know, of interconnectedness between god and goddess, and that had to become lessened and somehow made ugly? Is questionable. If it was a sort of unwanted pregnancy that she neither consented to nor asked for, and she stepped over this thing, and that in its sort of magical otherworldly way stepped over this threshold and created all these problems for her, that will kind of tie into the being really annoyed and being shamed and being angry and the fleeing part, possibly. So that's a possibility that I wondered about. It's me wondering about this myth. The final thing I wondered about is, were these geist, these curses, originally not that? Because as a primal goddess, as a primal mother goddess, mostly for the myth, could they not instead have been tests proving of her son? And we see Morrigan in this role, that she tests her heroes, you know, she pushes them into situations where they have to prove their worth and prove their honour. And I wonder if the same cannot be said here for the testing, the guises that Arianrhod lays upon Lugh. She refuses to name him, refuses to arm him, and that he shall not have a mortal wife. So by refusing to name him, skill therefore wins him his name from her. He, I think it's a needle, and he snaps a wren, and she calls him quick of hand or light of hand or something, and that therefore names him. Is it not possible that rather than the whole being tricked and things, this is the first step on the initiation to manhood in her primal goddess sense? Threat of war and his role as a bard and musician and things win him his arms. He is called on to defend his mother's realm from the threat of war, as well as his sort of musical accomplishments. Magic wins him a wife. They create Blooderweth for him. I believe his Math and Gwydion create her. And in that process he is reborn. because obviously there's the whole betrayal thing, spear in his side. There is argument that the spear in the side from earlier Celtic callings is actually about the twins, about the dark nature, whereby one helps create the king of light, and the dark twin, it's actually to do with forcing him to become a better king rather than feasting and not being a good king. And he's reborn through that process where he's transformed into an eagle and then transformed back again. Is it not possible that she is set real tests, real challenges to overcome, because Lugh then is considered to be this great, if not like the great king of light, or, you know, and of all those things. And she's supposedly has her own court, her own kingdom, connected to the Moonland, the land of the dead, reincarnation, karma, and the Kasi, which is a magical realm of the north, so I'm connecting it with the stars and the heavens. And she has her own court that she rules over, so, you know, she has her own queen status, not like the Morrigan. So cannot these tests be seen as stages in life, in transforming him from, I mean, he undergoes so much transformation anyway. He's a blob and he's born into a magical being through a chest. He's born into a birth. And skill wins him his name, and then he sort of becomes the boy. Threat of war and that win him his arms, and he becomes a man. The magic and the wife element, you could see that as earning him death and then rebirth through his transformation into an eagle and transformation into a better king. So if she has power over the cycles, lunar cycles being connected here, and lunar cycles were of great importance to the Celts, and reincarnation and karma and proving of oneself through cycles. I think it's very possible they were originally not necessarily curses, but stepping stones to greatness, if you like testing him to become better, to become more than he was. So I think that's what all we wanted to cover for Arianrhod. I was desperately trying to find some different myths, and this is just the one that came up over and over and over again. So if there are any others, please leave comments down below so I can go have a read about it. But I did want to finally finish up on perhaps the idea of the primal feminine goddess, and obviously the damage myths can do, because a lot of people read these myths and would be very put off by that, you know, and rather look into it and rather than delve into it, think that she might be this vindictive goddess. And I think, again, this is one of these goddesses which you're going to have to, for the large part, look beyond the basic myth into meditative work and learning to see for what you feel and who she is, rather than Christianization of myths by Christian monks, because that sort of, it could well be slander, like has been suggested, and trying to take away her divine feminine power somewhat. That's happened with the Morrigan myths, you know, even the art in some cases, and I think it's true here. So that's going to be it for this week's Celtic Calling. Many blessings.